Hi everyone, today I'm talking to Stephen Hall, who is a lecturer in politics, language and international studies at the University of Bath. Hi, Stephen.
Hi.
So, Stephen, I have several questions regarding the latest developments in Ukraine. So I would like just to start from the first one. So what's your view on the latest conflict developments in Ukraine?
Well, I mean, everything's up in the air at the moment since Donald Trump was elected as president, for the 47th president in America. So everything is very much up in the air. We never quite know which Donald Trump is going to appear in the morning and what his policy on basically anything is going to be during the day. To an extent, it all depends on who he's last spoken to. So this is both frightening, it's frightening in general, because we assume that having got control of the Senate and the House of Representatives, and there are now very few normal people, to quote, who are going to actually stop the Donald from doing what he wants, it could be quite worrying, because he's going to appoint people who have a similar view to him. In regards to Ukraine, this is certainly an issue, primarily because European states have spent the last 4 years navel-gazing and hoping that Donald Trump was not going to be re-elected, and yet again have failed to look after their own security issues. If Donald Trump decides to solve the Ukraine war, or crisis, I think he called it, in a day, then this is going to be really problematic, because the only way he can solve it primarily is to give Russia everything it wants. So we are certainly at a time, I think, of unknown crisis. We have been for quite a while, but this is a new unknown crisis, and it is particularly worrying in terms of what has come out so far, his peace plan being perhaps the most worrying possibility so far.
But in your opinion, I mean, this is impossible to end something in one day. So do you suspect that in case if they limit the US aid to Ukraine, the conflict will continue, right? Because Ukraine will not concede its territories, and Russia has upper hand, right? So why would they give up?
I think it's quite clear that Ukraine will not cede its territory. So I can't remember the exact figures, so please forgive me, but there was a poll conducted by some researchers, one of whom I know quite well, who found that something like 70% of Ukrainians will still keep fighting. Now, if we assume that not everyone, what they say to pollsters and what actually happens when push comes to shove are different things, that's still frightening, that if we assume a bare minimum 40% of Ukrainians are going to keep on fighting, that is a frightening scenario, that even without American or European weapons in hand, Ukrainians are still going to fight Russia. That is going to be a particularly frightening scenario. I think that certainly Trump's peace plan is simply that Russia gets to keep what it owned, what it's taken, that Ukraine will be given security guarantees, and that there will be a demilitarized zone policed by European forces. Now, there are many questions. One, what does the security guarantees for Ukraine actually mean? Are we talking a batch of NLAWs, or are we talking about ATACMS and continual American support for Ukraine? And he seems to also backtracked today, or J.D. Vance did, I can't remember if it was today or yesterday, on the actual security guarantees as to what those mean. Now, we also know that Russian legislation incorrectly says that 4 Ukrainian regions have been liberated and they are now part of the Russian Federation: Kharkiv, Kherson, Donetsk and Luhansk. And Putin has been consistent in saying that Ukrainian soldiers have to go back, have to leave the borders of these oblasts, because facts on the ground and all this that he keeps on talking about. That's very different to giving Russia what it already owns. If Russia's legislation says that these are 4 provinces of the Russian Federation, the logic dictates the Russian military at the very least has to get to those borders, and so will not willingly accept just being told this is where you stop, and there you go. On top of that, the demilitarized zone, which will be policed, according to Donald Trump, by European soldiers, isn't going to cut water for the Kremlin. Simply that these countries are so-called unfriendly countries, and there's no way that Russia is going to allow unfriendly countries to have any sort of contribution to the demilitarized zone, even if it was to be in existence. So you're probably going to rely on Kazakh and Belarusian armed forces, and I'm fairly certain the Ukrainians are not going to be particularly happy about Belarusian soldiers in support, in the demilitarized zone. And finally, of course, the neutrality of Ukraine for 20 years is another key point of Trump's peace plan. That doesn't hold water for the Kremlin either. The Kremlin has been very clear. Ukraine has to be neutral, and it has to be neutral in perpetuity. And it isn't a neutrality as in Switzerland or Sweden before the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It's a neutrality that Ukraine is entirely beholden to what Russia wants. This war, for the most part, began with the annexation of Crimea and the Donbass war in 2014. Because Ukraine was going to sign an association agreement with the EU. It is Russia does not accept Ukraine leaving its sphere of influence. It doesn't accept Ukraine joining any organisations that are not controlled by Russia. And as Russia is clearly never going to join NATO or the EU in my lifetime, and possibly yours as well, that simply isn't going to happen. In terms of the Kremlin's feeling. So they're not going to buy into the 20-year hiatus effectively, because we can guarantee that as soon as that 20 years is up, the Ukrainians will apply to join NATO. So no is the answer. This peace plan is dead on arrival, in my opinion. I don't think Donald Trump actually cares that much about the peace plan. I think he can then use it to say, well, we tried, the Ukrainians are being difficult, and therefore good luck to you, you're on your own. And this will just mean that the war continues. I think European states, having, as I said, navel gazed for the last 4 years, are suddenly realizing they're going to have to deal with this situation. This will take at least a year for them to be able to support Ukraine to any extent. So I think for now, the 2024 has been difficult for Ukraine. 2025 is going to be difficult for Ukraine. If they can hold on until 2026, it may get better, but who knows what's going to happen then. Predicting this war has been difficult in many respects to predict. And you don't want predicting even a month in advance is hard. Predicting what will happen in 2 years is impossible. What I would like to see is that where European states start telling their electorate immediately that this war is existential to Europe and that they need to get behind Ukraine and provide Ukraine with whatever they need. That will take time, and some European states, sadly, Germany particularly, but also Austria and to a lesser extent Spain, are simply not going to get involved in this, and the less said about Hungary and Slovakia, the better. But perhaps some countries can start to come together, particularly those in Eastern Europe, Czechia and Britain, and start to actually support Ukraine as it should be. I would like to think that Keir Starmer can find a workaround where he doesn't need to go to Donald Trump and ask if he can use storm shadows or send storm shadows to Ukraine. I'm sure that there are ways around that Starmer and Macron can implement in terms of legislation that can allow them to freely ship as many storm shadows as necessary to Ukraine. But we'll wait and see on that.
I see. But do you think that also it's in the interest of Zelensky to continue, because it seems like if the war is over, let's say, and there any type of agreement is reached, he'll have to go, right, and there will have to be elections held. Also, I have a feeling that he would like to continue it going. As long as it goes, he will stay in power as well, in my opinion.
Okay, that's true. Yes, he will stay in power as long as the war is going. But what is the alternative at the moment? I mean, if the war isn't going, then I can only assume that Russia has won, and Zelensky is out of power anyway. and you will, I say you, Ukrainians will have Viktor Yanukovych back, or Viktor Medvedchuk, or whichever pro-Russian idiot the Russians have been able to find. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. Whichever pro-Russian politician the Russians have been able to find. That isn't, Zelensky is out of power anyway. Now, would Ukrainians prefer an election where where there's free choice, or an election that has no choice but involves so-called Russian liberation, as the Russians like to talk about liberating Ukrainian land? So, yes, I can imagine that Zelensky does think, as any politician does, that this is a way to stay in power. It's also the case for Putin. Then this also fits in with why I don't think the peace plan is workable, even if it was actually well thought through. And this is why I think that the war will continue in some form. Putin needs the war to remain in power. It's a way to legitimate himself amongst Russians, because Russia is the victim in this war, as the Kremlin has portrayed itself, that they have been deceived. What is it? In 2023, he mentioned the fact that Russia had been deceived in relation to Ukraine 7 times. In 2024, and 2024 hasn't ended yet, he's already mentioned it 11 times, as far as I remember. So this is something that the Kremlin is playing the victim card here, and a peace solution for Ukraine does not fit into that idea that Russia is the victim. So the war needs to continue. Now, for Putin, I think it needs to continue far more than it needs to continue for Zelensky. Perhaps I'm looking at it with rose-tinted spectacles, and perhaps I have a positive view of Zelensky that he doesn't deserve at various times. I fully admit that. But I don't think he is seriously thinking, yes, we must continue the war at all costs so that I can remain in power. I think he genuinely would like to find a solution that, one, keeps him alive, but more importantly, keeps Ukrainians alive. And that won't happen if the way the war could plausibly end in the near future, if America and Donald Trump backtrack, and if Europe does not sort itself out in the near future.
Yeah, and do you think that, if, for instance, if something happens to Putin, I mean, they will still continue the war, right? Nothing will change. This regime will stay in power, right?
Well, the regime itself will almost certainly stay in power, but I can imagine, I mean, we don't know. Again, this is all predicting what will actually happen with the war. I think that many of the elites within Russia, yes, they've kept very quiet, but they don't necessarily approve of the war. The war itself, you just need to look at the Security Council meeting on the 22nd of February. The war itself, by looking at that meeting and who said what, it seems to be quite clear, at least in my interpretation, that Putin, Nikolai Patrushev, Alexander Bortnikov, and Sergei Shoigu knew about what was going to happen. Whereas you look at Sergei Lavrov, Sergei Naryshkin, Mikhail Mishustin, they were clearly having to try and guess what Putin was saying. Now, it could be, of course, because Putin, as is his wont, had a very long monologue at the beginning of the Security Council meeting saying what we need to do and all of these things, we've been deceived and yada yada yada, and NATO is bad, and all these sorts of things, and Ukraine are neo-Nazis. And it could just be that Bortnikov, Patrushev, and Shoigu read the signals. But these people have been in power pretty much. Sergei Lavrov has been a foreign minister since 2004, and many of these people have been in power for a long time. They also are good at reading signals, and yet they didn't. They had no idea what was happening. Sergei Naryshkin especially. Dmitry Kozak, the Kremlin's curator in Ukraine, misread everything. So I think it's a small group of people who made this decision. Now, I can imagine that one thing, and this is something that Russia has been very good at in the past, in the Tsars, to a lesser extent with the Soviet Union and Dmitry Medvedev in 2008, of changing how others see them. I can imagine that because Dmitry Patrushev, not Nikolai, Nikolai Patrushev, has been in power also from the same age as Putin, primarily, lots of these people, that if there is a change in the regime, the elites will want to see a change that is significant enough for Western states to lower the sanctions on Russia, because it's hurting the elites. Now, at the moment, the sanctions aren't hurting the elites enough, and we can talk about that, but that's how I envisage the change. And they will want someone who is representative enough of a new Russia. So that generally will involve a younger person. It would involve someone from outside the inner circle. Shoigu, Patrushev, Bortnikov, Chemezov, they will all have no opportunity to be presidents of Russia. And so you're probably going to see someone who goes, okay, the past regime made a mistake by invading Ukraine. Let's sit down at the table. I would like to negotiate a peaceful solution to enhance European security. We can discuss this. Look, I know how to use an iPad. I can use whichever social media network is important at this time, TikTok, and look how different I am to Putin and Medvedev. And I'm sure some in the West will buy this again, every single time. They will keep buying this. And I can imagine that this is one way that the Russian Kremlin will maintain power, but it will be a slightly different regime.
I see. And in terms of sanctions, it seems like they really haven't worked successfully, or you think they have influenced somehow Russia's behavior?
Look, sanctions take time, and I don't buy the argument that sanctions haven't worked, so we need to find an alternative. We can see that the central bank has raised the low interest rate, the base interest rate, by 21%. And Elvira Nabiullina was very clear, we'll raise it again. And they'll keep on doing it incrementally because the Russian economy is suffering. And this is another reason why I think Putin will have to keep continuing this war, because the war is the only thing that's keeping the Russian economy from overheating and collapsing effectively. This will be very difficult for the next person. It will be difficult for the next person to stop the war, but I think, going back to it, they will need to find a way to stop the war in order to be able to improve a relationship with the West. And if the new president, let's say, I don't know, Sergei Smirnov, comes to power and continues the war, then I can imagine that the Western states will go, well, this is more than just Putin. This is Russian elites. We need to actually do something about this and support Ukraine, not just to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, which was always the wrong slogan. It should have been support Ukraine to win this war as quickly as possible. And I think that would also change the perspective amongst many Western elites that this isn't just Putin, this is the Russian elite as it is now, and change has to happen. And the only way to do that is to support Ukraine to bring the Kremlin to the negotiating table and at a position of strength. Now, ideally, it would be great if Ukraine could get back to its 1991 borders. I think that's unlikely at the moment, but that may happen in the future. But being able to bring the Kremlin to the table rather than the other way around is significant. And I think that if Putin has to continue the war because the economy has to continue in terms of the war, and for him it's existential, if the next Russian government continues the war, then I think Western states will support Ukraine far harder than they have done.
I just have a quick question. You mentioned that he's interested in supporting the war, but originally he expected it to be very fast, right? And he thought that they will take Kiev and topple Zelensky very quickly, right? And now they're experiencing a lot of economical issues, right? And they have labor shortage, and it's not easy for them to mobilize people. They don't want to do this again, like this partial mobilization. So also involving North Koreans as well to address some of those issues. Yeah. So you think he's really that interested? Or, I mean, now probably yes, because they have an upper hand, right? They have strategic advantage, but later on, yeah, at some point they might decide to negotiate if the offensive slows down, right?
I mean, again, predicting what is possible. Putin has always done the unpredictable. And I'm not saying Putin is a great grandmaster in chess. That's something that I think has always been the wrong interpretation of Putin. He reacts to the situation. If the situation were to change and it was to get worse for the Russians exponentially, then he could potentially change. Now, I think that for him, Ukraine has been existential. He's always believed that Ukraine is a part of Russia. This isn't, in my view, an imperialist war. It's a national war. It's national. The perception that Russians and Ukrainians are the same people, at least in Putin's warped perception of it. He's been quite clear that the costs are worth it. And again, I think this fits into the argument put forward by others far intelligent than I am, that he needs the war to continue to remain in power. And so there comes a point when, having failed to get the easy victory that would have legitimated him and probably could have led to him leaving the presidency because he was sorted for life in terms of having brought Belarus and Ukraine as the two little brothers back to Russia, that would have ensured his survival for the rest of his life. He would be written in all the history books. He may well be now, but for a different reason. I think with the war having continued in the way it is, it's very hard for someone. Now, this goes into psychology, and it's always hard to predict psychology because we simply can't talk to Vladimir Putin. But it's very hard when someone's invested so much in something to let it go. Having spent so much, you spend more in order to try and achieve the result you actually want, believing that there is only so much more you need to spend. It's like a person gambling. You know, when you lose everything, you'll still put all your shirt, as it were, on black in the hope that eventually it will work out and you'll be able to recuperate your losses. It's very hard to walk away. Now, I think that this is something that Putin is stuck with at the moment. That his survival to a great extent, his personal survival to a great extent, and the survival of his, 7 grandchildren or something. He's mentioned grandchildren for the first time, and I think he said 7, but it could also be children, illegitimate and legitimate. It's also going to be a problem for them. Russia has a history of killing its leaders, and their families. Now, I'm not saying that will happen here, but certainly this is something I think that Putin is wary of. So I can't imagine that there is an easy way for him to backtrack now. And the Americans were amazed, at least if you read the Washington Post and the New York Times, they were utterly amazed at the beginning of the war. Biden gave him so many off-ramps as a way to de-escalate the situation, and Putin just ploughed straight through them. So I don't necessarily think there is an off-ramp for Vladimir Putin, at least not one that he's willing to give up. Now, it could be, and this is again the idea that denazification, demilitarization, they're loose terms. The Kremlin is a great propaganda machine. It can turn around and say, yes, we've won the war at any point. It doesn't need to be factually correct, but it will be able to pin that, and that may happen. But when you talk about demilitarization, Ukraine's military is probably not now because it's been fighting a long war, but certainly is highly militarized, let's put it that way. And if you believe that the regime government is Nazi, is a Nazi government, that means you topple it. And that isn't going to happen as well. So it becomes very difficult for Putin to find a way out of this. Psychologically, and probably also because I think he's like Donald Trump. when he makes a decision, he sticks with it and he never lets go. Now, that may not actually be true of Donald Trump, but Donald Trump certainly, like Putin, doesn't like to lose face. And for Putin, this is a loss of face, and he may, if he loses in Ukraine, I think there could be a real problem for him in terms of staying in power. And again, this goes back to his own survival. So it's a really hard way out of this war, and it goes back to what I said about the slogan being wrong from the very beginning from the West. We will support Ukraine for as long as it takes. The West has, to put it mildly, a huge problem with short-termism. That once one issue moves on, the West will move on as well. And we saw this when Hamas invaded Israel. The West moved on from Ukraine primarily, and this will be the problem, I think, here. So yeah, it's a real challenge in terms of where this is going. At the moment, as you say, Russia has the upper hand. It believes that Western governments have a lower attention span, a shorter attention span, sorry, and it believes that Donald Trump will do a deal. And so it just needs to carry on. Yeah.
Stephen, one more question I have. Who do you think overall is winning the propaganda war, Russia or Ukraine?
That's a difficult one to say. I would say that Ukraine has always got the David scenario, the David versus Goliath. Ukraine will always win in terms of, I think, the general population. In terms of Russia has the ability to use significant number of bots and trolls to distort information in terms of social media. If we believe the led by donkeys analysis of Elon Musk, then the idea that Elon Musk seems to be a conspiracy theorist, seems to be speaking, or was, according to the Wall Street Journal, speaking to Sergei Kiriyenko in Russia, and allegedly Vladimir Putin as well for the past year. He's bought into the Russian narrative. Now, that's a problem because the way that the X, or Twitter, as everyone should call it, algorithm has been changed is that Elon Musk is the most read person on X unless you block him. So that will certainly be a way for Russia to get its narratives out there onto social media, and not just change public opinion, because I don't necessarily think it's changing too many opinions in the public, but it will change politicians' opinions to a great extent, because Elon Musk is so important for the American government, but Donald Trump especially is the biggest financier of the Republican Party now. So I think this is a really difficult question in terms of who is actually winning the media war. In terms of overall, I think Ukraine is still winning the media war. Now, in terms of, unfortunately, those who are important, Russia is equal, if not winning.
Stephen, thanks a lot for all your answers.
No,
important questions.
I hope we can talk again. Thank you very much.
Thanks.